Welcome to the 30/30 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Guillermo Ruiz.
Hello everyone and welcome to the 30/30 Health Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Alan Christianson. He is a New York Times Bestselling Author and an Arizona-based Naturopathic Medical Doctor. He specializes in natural endocrinology with a focus on thyroid disorders. He is the author of the Adrenal Reset Diet, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Thyroid Disease, and Healing Hashimoto's, a savvy patient's guide. Dr. Christianson is a member of the first graduating class of the Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine. He graduated in 1996. He has been actively practicing in Scottsdale ever since. He frequently appears on national TV shows like Dr. Oz, CNN, The Doctors, and The Today Show, as well as print media like Women's World, USA Today, Newsweek, and Shape magazine. If you enjoy our conversation, be sure to visit my website. That's www.3030strong.com. That's 3030strong.com. And if you really enjoy the podcast, you should leave me a review on iTunes. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the interview. Hello everyone, I'm here with Dr. Christianson, and we are in this really cool studio that he set up, and he's been kind enough to offer me an interview for my podcast. So welcome to my podcast, and Dr. Christianson, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great.
So I want to start this interview by asking you about your hero story. How did you go from, growing up in Minnesota and...
that hero story. I thought we were going to talk about Spider-Man or something.
The origin story of Batman, because I don't think a lot of people...
Let's talk about that one.
How did you go from being, in rural Minnesota to becoming this force in healthcare?
Yeah, funny thing. I probably thought that I was destined towards some career in astrophysics. I'd probably be, missing my sleep and staying up late and being in a observatory somewhere had the course not taken the directions that it did. I was not a healthy kid. I had complications from cerebral palsy. I had seizures, and I just couldn't run or play properly, and gained a ton of weight from that, and really got to experience how central health is to all facets of your life. Just, your physicality, your ability to connect socially, your self-confidence, and I got to experience how medicine doesn't really have the answers. If you're in a train wreck, they can do some good things, but in many circumstances, there's not clear benefit from that world. And I also realized that data that you utilize and synthesize and act upon can just change your life in the most profound ways. And I experienced that. I read health books, and I, bumbling through it, did the stuff that I read and stuck with it, fits and starts, but was able to become an athlete and lose weight and regain some motor skills. And it just changed my life. I'm like, wow, this is stuff that a random kid stumbled across in a library. The doctors weren't giving me this. I'm like, wow, there's got to be some kind of a gap that exists. And it just was an obvious calling to, it was an interest at some point, a personal interest to want to learn more. You get momentum going, but also just to help share that stuff and help others along that journey.
And I think that, going to Naturopathic Medical School at SCNM, during your first week, we have this ceremony, the sharing stick ceremony. And we all sit and we're on the ground cross-legged, and we're all telling our story. And everyone has a different story, but the narrative is the same. You come from a place of being unhealthy or taking care of someone that's unhealthy.
Yeah.
And through your own curiosity, you might start looking into this diet or looking at this book and just scratching your head and thinking to yourself, what we're doing might not be correct. The problem is that there are so many blogs, there are so many podcasts, and, Dr. Google is, probably being visited many, many times per day.
Roughly 1 billion.
A billion times per day.
For health topics.
And that's just for health topics.
Yeah.
And sometimes the information might be good for a certain subset of people,
But how do we guide ourselves, especially right now in the new year? What are some problems that you see that people are stumbling upon when they're trying to reroute their health?
I just did a survey for my audience. I love to just stay connected and see what people's needs are and not assume or guess, but I asked them, and we had about a couple thousand responses. By far, weight, energy, big two things, thyroid, adrenal, but in many cases, those point back to the other two symptoms. So yeah, struggling with weight, struggling with fatigue, those were by far the most critical pressing issues for people.
And fatigue and weight gain are really related to each other, and they're connected. So you see on your Facebook feed all of these challenges and all of these crash diets, and they sound very appealing. And you have this theory of like having very, very strict rules and how that's appealing, and how the approach that is sensible and that is science based and has all of these different studies or evidence behind, it's not so appealing. So then we end up falling for the crash diet, and then that's when you see revert yo-yo diets and all of this stuff. So in your practice, in your clinic, how do you approach and how do you merge this two in order to create this buy-in from your patients in order for them to follow your guidelines, and then at some point changing, because sometimes it's not sustainable.
Mm-hmm. And that's a matter of just thinking about it as a process of phases. And I'll tell someone that in the concern more so of weight, that I've seen a fair amount of evidence arguing that many can do well when they have some quick initial loss, when it's done right. A lot of ways can be pitfalls, but if it's done well, it can be psychologically motivating for them. They can feel some confidence and greater competence because they're seeing their efforts pay off in some way. And with the right steps in place, it can be even more sustainable. There's been some papers on that approach.
And and I've seen it firsthand, shadowing you at your office, how people that had stubborn weight loss, and they couldn't, or their energy was low, and by doing this, 4-week plan or this very specific plan, they adhere to it, they change, and now they're ready for the next step.
I think about this idea of decision fatigue quite a bit. And some ideas that are simple can be effective just because of that, because there's not a lot of moving parts and not a lot of things to think about. And, long term, the world is complex. We'll have a lot of food choices, and you've got to sort that out somewhere along the way. But during some initial phase of shifting, it's nice to have just not a lot of things to think about and fewer decisions to have to make.
And there's always like weddings or parties, and you can't be in this bubble, just eating a ketogenic diet for the rest of your life. You could, but is it really sustainable?
Well, I'm not advocating a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, exactly. And or any diet, you name it, you name it. Back to the stubborn weight loss. What are you have a book on adrenal fatigue, you have a book on thyroid hormones. What are the number one problem that you see with your patients that they might not think is a problem, but they come in and it's like right there on the paper, and you're like, well, this is what we need to address?
Well, one thing that is relevant and that many don't think about is just the chronic toxic burden that we often carry. You talk about what they're aware of, and of those that do see me, most are aware of having Hashimoto's or thyroid disease. They've already been diagnosed or on various treatment regimes. And more now have a sense, I'd like to shout out to Dr. Isabella Wentz, more of a sense about digging to their root causes and seeing what are the things real behind the scenes for that. And in that sense, they're very receptive to screening and identifying those causes. And people have a sense academically that the toxins we breathe are bad for you. But it's often a real big shocker to say, oh my God, you got some mercury in your body. Where did that come from? Like, well, how could that happen to me? And so that's probably one that does really throw people.
When I moved to Arizona, I came in, focusing on nutrition and focusing on just this very sleep, nutrition, exercise. And then eventually I started like getting more in tune with burden, toxic burden. What percentage of your patients roughly have some sort of toxic burden?
Well, if the threshold is any measurable burden, then we all do.
Yeah, we all do. Yeah.
I've heard data saying that you could take ice core samples. I mean, people have ice core samples from half a mile deep in Antarctica, and you can find DDT on that.
Jeez.
So there's no clean places left on the planet. As far as a significant burden, that's a tough thing because I don't want to be overly alarmist or amplify mountains out of molehills. But yeah, of those who already have existing autoimmune disease, I'd say probably a quarter, a third have some level of burden that does take rather intensive, targeted, monitored detox. Pretty much all of us, have some measurable amount of burden, which is worth addressing and coaxing out.
And that's very important because within populations, if you don't have autoimmune disease, you might be able to just buffer this burden. But when you start, layering different conditions, now that toxic burden starts to become a problem. And I've seen it, at your office and then at the clinic at SCNM, I've seen how with very little treatment or with very pointed treatment, you can reverse that burden. And then all of a sudden, all of the steps that they were taking before to have a better diet, to sleep, they start falling into place.
Well, that's the beautiful thing about being doctors versus mechanics. If you're a mechanic, someone pulls in and they've got their tires are shot and maybe the radiator's leaking and the timer's not working properly. Those are all issues that require separate attention. But medically, someone can have autoimmunity and fatigue and weight gain and whatever else. And if you address some core issue, many other things self-regulate. So that's the neat thing about working with self-regulating homeostatic systems.
And so let's go into a little bit a different subject. The topic of biohacking is super popular right now, and we've had conversations about biohacking, but I think we're both of the opinion that this self-regulated system cannot be biohacked.
Yeah, I have many friends who would identify with the term, and I'm not one to really get too strong about semantics or whatnot, but there are some concepts that I would raise concerns about. And one big one is just that the term hack has often been used a lot in the tech world. And there's many things that you can you make software and you can try it out in some application, and if it doesn't work, we rewrite the code. You can iterate it and keep modifying it, and I think that mindset is often spilled into managing our bodies. Like, well, something's not perfect. Why can't we test or tamper or play with some idea? The difficulty is that these self-regulating systems, they don't always respond in linear, predictable ways. You push a swing south and it's going to go north when you let go. And the body can be like that. But the other big difference is that you can't just restart if something goes wrong. You can have major consequences that are unforeseen and unexpected. So it's
So what I'm trying to get to is that there might be two different problems with this, or two different objectives to biohacking. You can have, you can include different things in your diet, or you can optimize things within your physiology that agree with your physiology to make you a better person.
I guess the way I think about it, so let's say we're talking about brain performance. I've seen many talk about that variable. So you want your brain to work faster. You want quicker processing speed. So the biohacking mindset is, well, what are all the things that might speed up the brain, and how can we do that times 10? And that logic is wonderful in simple machines. But in an organic system, what I would argue could be a higher approach is to say, what are the things that would innately slow down this process? What are the things that would get in the way of that? What are the barriers? And how can we remove those barriers? How can we let the system work at its optimal best? Not how can we, pour in some nitrous oxide in the engine and go faster for a while, but how can we really free up its potential, knowing that it's got a potential to certain parameters.
Because you're not going to biohack yourself out of sleep.
Right.
That is a physiological requirement that you can cheat the system for a period of time, and eventually it'll catch up with it.
Yeah.
So,
the irony too is that a lot of things like that, like your sleep, for example, the first thing that happens is your judgment is impaired. So you're walking around basically drunk and you think you're the best dancer in the room. Yeah, you skip your sleep and you have a sense you're doing fine because your capacity to self-criticize is now diminished.
So you think you're the best answer, but I'm not. You might not be the best answer. So who are the patients that you're seeing at your practice? Are they people that have tried everything and then they have gotten 90% of better and they're just waiting for the 10% to click? Or are they people that have heard from you from your social media or your appearances and they end up at your practice?
All of the above except for the percentage.
Okay.
That's all spot on. I think most have more of a gap between where they are in their health goals. And I wouldn't say that they're, 5% or 10%, but they've got a gap because, they've often had to go out of their way a bit, travel, or just they've already seen the doctors that are in their insurance or whatnot. So they've had to take some steps. So they typically have more of a gulf between their current health and what their ideal health is, but all the rest was totally spot on.
And, it's funny, you're being modest because I have been at your practice and people are so thankful for having seen you, and they say things like, "Thank you for giving me my life back." And I don't know how you get their lives first in the first place, and where you keep them. But
redheads steal souls.
But why we spend so much money on healthcare, and we are so good, like you said at the beginning of the interview, at trauma procedures, at surgery.
Kudos to that world.
Where did we go wrong? Why aren't the people that at the front lines? The New Yorker had an excellent article this past weekend about how the people at the front lines, the people doing the incremental changes to health, are the true heroes, because they're going to make better healthcare outcomes in the long run. And the analogy they made is that when a bridge falls apart, how many majors are going to get a standing ovation for fixing a bridge versus, creating a new bridge? And they are heroes, our first responders and our trauma, surgeons and neurosurgeons. They are heroes. But how can we get the people repairing the bridge, which is less expensive to repair a bridge? It potentially saves lives, because we're not going to build a bridge until that other bridge breaks apart.
Or even more boring, what about the engineer that drew up a better draft?
Yeah.
He never even knew about anything.
and all of the engineers agree that it's more cost effective to fix bridges.
Yeah.
But it is sexier to build a bridge. So, we're in the same paradox. Mm-hmm. Where did we go wrong? And do you see any push towards, with fancy words like functional medicine or this biohacking? Do you feel that the waves are turning and that we're going to start fixing bridges now?
I think all these things, and I think also just the rising level of consumer awareness and engagement in health are all going to be factors towards it. And I do believe that we will move towards more of a paradigm of preventive care and really managing causative factors. I think it's inevitable. If you look at the long course of healthcare in our last 100,000 years, there was a pretty flat rate of progression for probably 99,000 years, and then some slow progression. And we've made some good leaps and bounds. And the long, looking at it from the distance, there's been clear progress. In the moments, there's a lot of meandering. There's probably more meandering in the short term than there is clear progress. But I'm sure that we'll self-right that. And somewhere along the way, we focused a lot on things that were easy to measure. And it was a good strategy, but the difficulty is that you can win a battle and lose a war. So we focus hard on pushing around things like cholesterol or blood pressure or blood sugar. And they're valid markers of disease or valid markers of dysfunction. But the problem is that we've treated them as ends onto themselves. Like, you've got this high cholesterol, that's a problem, you gotta lower the cholesterol. Well, so why is that high? And what are the real risk factors that are relevant? What are the causative factors behind that? And, there was a joke about a man who was stumbling in an alley and, drunk and walking around at night, and the police found him and said, "Well, what are you doing?" "I'm looking for my keys." "Did you lose them in here?" And he goes, "No, I lost them down the street back over there, but the lighting's better here. And, that's kind of what happened with science. You can do easy science over the course of a few months on changing a biomarker, but it takes a lot of time and larger amounts of people and researchers when you're tracking many variables like lifestyle. So it's very easy to say, in a few months, the drug lower cholesterol. That's easy, clean science. It's simple.
It's results.
It's results, yeah. But the drawback is now we're starting to see it doesn't correlate with the outcomes, and it's the outcomes we care about.
And you have been a very big stickler with me about evidence and levels of evidence, because I did come to the naturopathic movement through the paleo diet. I've seen, very cool things happen when you change from a standard American diet, a SAD diet, into a different diet that is more nutrient dense. But as a researcher and all the research that I've done, I'm very good at killing cancer cells in vitro.
There's a lot of ways to do that.
Yeah, I can do that. You can put bleach on them. But I'm very good at, picking a botanical and figuring out a mechanism of action and, killing it. But what happens when that doesn't apply to humans?
Yeah.
And then the levels of evidence change, and I can publish a paper that says this botanical kills cancer cells in vitro. The problem lies when you have practitioners that skip all of the different levels of evidence and they go directly into the in vitro model, and now they're trying to apply that to populations. And we see that with many things. We see that with diet. We see that with cholesterol. How do you sort yourself through this information, and how do you make the decision to apply what's relevant to your clients or to your patients?
Yeah, the evidence thing is great. I think everyone should have an understanding of that concept. Is that you've got hypothetical data, you've got like mind experiments, you've got laboratory experiments, things that happen in test tubes, and you've got things that have happened within humans of markers, and you've got actual outcomes, like did someone die or not, the most important outcomes. And they're all ranked hierarchically because what happens here trumps what happens lower. So I see two big errors. The conventional world in the natural, holistic, functional, whatever you want to call this world here, they make opposite errors. So this side fails to look up. So they like to speculate. And the world of biochemistry is huge, and there's infinite interconnectedness. So you can speculate a lot of things, and you can make very plausible arguments on why, anything you could imagine, any particular outcome you could imagine, you can very cogent arguments. You can often even find some low-level in vivo data to support that. But there may be higher data that contradicts it. There may be outcome studies showing something very different. You can make strong arguments that grains would cause autoimmunity. And then you can look at actual evidence of Mediterranean diets and rates of autoimmunity in those that consume a lot of grains. And outcome always trumps speculation. So many people fail to look up. The conventional world often fails to look down. So in the absence of data, it's worth looking down. So the ultimate analogy of that was a British Medical Journal paper about the parachute study. I think I've told you about this one. So there's no good studies that parachutes actually are more effective than a placebo parachute. But we take that for granted, rightfully so. So in the lack of highest double-blind placebo-controlled studies, it's worth considering anecdotes, or it's worth considering hypotheses.
Or N equals 1.
Yeah, right.
It's a great place to start.
Yeah, that's valid data in a vacuum of other data. So there's many scenarios in which we don't have clear data from the drug model, and so it's worth looking at plausible hypothetical data from the other realms. So you've got to look up and you've got to look down.
And I think with the advent of the information that we have, we can make stronger cases with N equals 1. And I've talked to a couple of people about this, Dr. Michael Ruscio and Rob Wolf, about how we can do this side experiment where all these people are doing these interventions, and they are at the level of N equals 1. But if we can have a single repository for all these people to input their data, now that N equals 1 is...
it's a meta-analysis.
It's a meta-analysis, yeah. And maybe once we have that information, now we can allocate resources, because people are trying this stuff already. And then we can spend money on the things that seem like they're going to work. And we might be wrong, and it might be a wash, but because of information, instead of being something against us, we can use this information and gather all this information and make easier access to data and maybe have the better outcomes. Now, how long have you been in practice?
Little over 20 years now.
And you are taking a sabbatical right now.
I am currently.
And of course, you're resting for the 6 months. You're not doing anything right now. I know you're super busy. Can you share some of the stuff that you're doing while you're on sabbatical?
Well, the big thing is gearing up for the next book, and then also really ramping up my process of putting out information. The system of our blogs, our videos, our content, and then also just helping manage the team, train the team more, and doing more case reviews and developing the clinic. So those are the big focuses. And then spending actually a lot of time, well, not exorbitant, but spending some time. I had a lot of surgeries recently, so I've been much more physically active again and just loving that. So I've been at the gym running much more often than ever before and just having a great time with it. So that's been where it's at.
We always look at all of our heroes, and all these personalities within healthcare. And Dr. Christianson, you have been very open about your health problems, and just this past Thanksgiving, you beat the turkey. So, it's been really inspiring, to see how everyone can't fall to disease or to injury. And I was very quickly reminded when we went to have a soup pie that you haven't lost your step, and you were 2 steps ahead of me, and I was huffing and puffing, and you were just climbing rocks. I don't know how you do it. So back to the evidence. Okay, so you are using a lot of resistant starch right now. Mm-hmm. Can you tell the audience how you're incorporating resistant starch to your plants?
Yeah, simple thing. I've included that as one of the main active ingredients in our shake, a way to get high amounts of it. The research on it is so exciting. It started in the 80s and it continues to just keep on overwhelming me. One of the last things I stumbled across is Australia, actually. Mm-hmm. So they've been aware of having the highest rates of colorectal cancer in the modern world. And they've done more screening. They've tried to catch up that way, but they realized that diet's critical. And so their first efforts were for just raising fiber content in the diet. And there's some good markers like butyrate that can give clues about longer term rates of colorectal cancer. They found that fiber alone was actually not helpful at all. They were not seeing the changes they wanted. And so now they're taking some steps to start fortifying their food sources across the board with resistant starch. They've got larger models showing that it has a greater protective effect. So yeah, colorectal cancer protection, all the issues of metabolic syndrome, so many core problems. So thyroid disease and diabetes, that's something we're looking at a lot. Yeah. Those things overlap so greatly, so many ways there, just a fascinating topic. But so many of the modern health issues involve poor use of fuel. The body is not absorbing glucose, bringing it into the muscles, burning it from the muscles, making the right amount from the liver, managing it properly. And that's the core issue behind almost all chronic disease, heart disease, brain aging, many cancers, diabetes, kidney damage. It's all about really fuel utilization. And the trick is, how do you get fuels that are steady and easy to burn and don't cause the fluctuations in the system when the system's compromised? If the system's not compromised, it can deal with a broader range of fuels. But there's been no other real food substance to date with as much potential that way that I've seen than resistant starch. So it's...
and that's so important too, this balance of fuel in and fuel out. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when we get into fat diets, we forget about calories.
Yeah.
And we think that, I'm going to do this diet that's very specific to this single macronutrient, and I can eat as much of it as I want.
Yeah.
But at some point, calories do matter. And at some point, getting enough of the 3 groups matters. Can you give the audience the example you use when people say, I'm eating a lot of protein, I'm eating a bunch of beans? Yeah.
Well, protein's an important topic to me too. I've seen a lot of effects with my own health by changing it over the years. I tried hard to go, I've been raw food, I've been vegan, I've been vegetarian. When I was my late teens, I went through pretty much any iteration of a diet you can imagine. Some were much more extreme than that. But I would just do so poorly, and I was just never at all satisfied in terms of hunger. And there's a paper I just read about the protein leveraging effect. The data is strong now that for some more than others, but by most to some degree, that protein is one way in which if you're lacking in it, the threshold seems to be 25%. The further you get below 25%, the more that carbs and fats won't satisfy. You want them, but they don't fill you up. And you get above that threshold, and it's a lot more reasonable. You can have appropriate amounts of food, and you're good with that. And I've lived that, and then and it's regardless of the calorie target. If you're, say your body needs 2,400 calories, and if you're 10% protein, and you stay at that 10% protein, you won't be satisfied at that food level. You'll always be somewhat hungry. So protein's critical that way.
One thing that people don't think about is that you can survive
Yeah.
with those levels of protein.
Yeah.
The problem is protein is used to build muscle, of course, but also to detoxify.
Yeah.
And it's so important for so many reasons. And if you don't have those protein levels, sure, you'll survive, but are you thriving?
I didn't close the gap on the beans you talked about. So you brought up a good point. These things tie together. So you think about like vitamin C, and we've got a clear sense about how scurvy is a bad thing, and how even the smallest amounts can ward away scurvy, like a little bit of citrus in your liquid if you're off at sea, keep from getting scurvy. But no one today would say that's the perfect amount of vitamin C and you wouldn't exceed that. Like that's enough, call it good. We all get that past that point of preventing scurvy, there may be benefits with a bit more than that or different circumstances. And so too with protein. So many have put up like a straw man argument saying that, well, if you're getting enough food, you can't be protein deficient. Well, it's like saying if you're having a bite of oranges once a week, you can't get scurvy. That doesn't mean you're getting all your produce.
You won't get scurvy. But, there's other functions, like you said, for vitamin C.
And it seems with protein, it's not even just how much you get, it's how much you get relative to the rest of your food intake. There's that threshold of about 25%. And the tough part about foods that have protein, like beans or nuts or seeds or cheeses, they've got protein, no debate about that. They can do a good job warding off kwashiorkor, protein calorie malnutrition. But you can never exceed that 25% threshold because they're primarily, protein's not the star of the movie. Protein's like an extra, it's like a small little part of it.
So they are a carbohydrate.
Beans are carbs. They're good carbs, but they're carbs. They're 5-to-1 carb to protein.
That they have a high level of protein, but they're still carbohydrates.
Nuts and seeds are good fats, but they're fats. 5-to-1 fat to protein.
Yeah, they are a good carb that have higher amounts of good oils or good fats.
Yeah.
That they're gonna increment your omega-3s. But you shouldn't consume them for their fat content. There are other reasons to consume beans. There are other reasons, resistant starch in beans. But if you want protein, you should eat protein. If you want something that, like omega-3 fatty acids, maybe you should consume some fish, and then you can create your perfect recipe for you to be a healthier person. Just very quickly, talking about this energy and how energy is so important. Thyroid is very, very important for your health and thyroid hormone. You discussed with me and you blew my mind when you told me about thyroid resistance. I don't think there's a lot of practitioners out there talking about thyroid resistance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there's circumstances in which the body is making hormone but not utilizing it adequately. And it occurs in two very different scenarios, one of which is an error and one is not. So the error one can occur more so from toxicology, extreme inflammation or chronic overload of cortisol, where there's not enough transmission of thyroid hormone across the cell membranes. The other scenario that's even more common is an intentional sort of resistance. So this is called euthyroid 6 syndrome, U like EU, like Europe, euthyroid 6 syndrome. And that's where your body is frazzled in some way and it's trying to slow itself down for safety purposes. So you've got a car that's, sputtering, the engine light's flashing, you're going to drive real gently to the garage. You want to actually make it not break down along the way. So there's times in which your health is compromised and your body intentionally puts the brake on the thyroid hormones. You try to make more reverse T3, less T3, and slow down metabolism because of some other problem.
Well, the analogy that I like to make is like insulin resistance. When there's an overload of energy, glucose, the GLUT4 receptors that accept the insulin are stopping the glucose because burning that glucose creates reactive oxygen species, just like when you burn fuel. Now, when you burn that fuel, those reactive oxygen species, they can burn the cell fast. Hyperglycemia will kill you, but it will kill you slowly.
Yeah.
So your body's trying to make a decision. Do I want to just not utilize the sugar and then get chronic inflammation, or do I want to kill my cells today? So then thyroid resistance, it's preventing, because thyroid is anabolic. You're trying to create things and you're trying to speed up processes. So what I was thinking about is, it's very funny that someone with hyperthyroid presents with fatigue.
Yeah.
And that's your body saying, nope.
Well, the funny thing, so that's a great example of the body being self-regulating, is that at the first few stages of hyperthyroidism, the person may have low levels of thyroid hormone. And they can have a lower TSH, but they may have low levels of T3 and T4. And that's their body just bailing that stuff out as fast as it can. And yeah, they can be run down or tired from that. Or even if they're at a later stage, they've had a high heart rate for so long, they've been running all day as far as how their metabolism feels. So they can be worn out. Yeah.
So you've seen patients with, palpitations and, just the classic signs of hyperthyroidism. But have you seen patients with the opposite picture? And what can you...
The opposite picture?
As in, fatigue.
Oh,
and,
for sure.
So then, it's frustrating that if you go to someone that is not as sophisticated with testing, and they see those labs and they look like they're euthyroid, they look like they have normal thyroid panels. And in fact, there's a utilization problem, not a production problem.
Or another issue, we would distinguish endogenous from exogenous hyperthyroidism, if it's from inside your body or from outside your body. And a very troubling common scenario that I see a lot is that doctors will have a patient who has thyroid toxicosis. They've got endogenous hyperthyroidism. They're taking too much thyroid.
Yeah.
They're on treatment, but they're overdosed. And their labs reflect early signs of that. Their TSH is suppressed. But there's been this belief that you can ignore those findings and that you want to just push through. And if you give someone more thyroid, their body's ability to siphon off the excess takes time to catch up with this change. And so for a little while, they do feel better. But the problem is then they catch up and now they're feeling worse again. And they're being exposed to these dangers from being at thyroid toxicosis.
And those dangers, palpitations, you can have a heart attack if you have too much thyroid. This is fascinating. And especially because you were the first person, and I read a lot of blogs and I read a lot of books, and I don't think, and no one had ever mentioned, at least to me, that, that there was something like thyroid resistance, and that's fascinating. How can my audience get a hold of you? How can they follow you? Where can they find your work?
Easy place, www.google.com.
1,000,000,001 searches.
No, just put my name in Google and I show up pretty easily.
Awesome.
Alan Christianson.
And you have a practice, and obviously you're in sabbatical right now, so you're not taking any patients. But are you going to open up your practice once you come back from sabbatical?
The practice is open.
Oh yeah, your practice. Yeah.
No, great, awesome team of doctors who are doing a good job, and some have trained with me for 4 years or more, and we've done tons of case reviews, and they know what I know oftentimes better than I do these days. And so,
and you're reviewing the cases too, so you're always there.
Yeah, we work together.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Christianson. This has been a pleasure, and I hope to continue working with you.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.